A crowded Boeing 737 sat at the gate of Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, preparing for a routine flight to Denver. As passengers settled into their seats, an 80-year-old man wearing a faded brown leather flight jacket, neatly pressed khaki trousers, polished black shoes, and carrying an old leather flight bag quietly walked toward the cockpit after being invited by a flight attendant. Several passengers immediately began complaining, believing an ordinary elderly traveler had mistakenly entered the restricted flight deck before departure. One man even demanded to know why an unauthorized passenger was being allowed inside the cockpit. The old man simply smiled and disappeared behind the cockpit door without saying a word. Moments later, a serious technical malfunction affected one of the aircraft's primary flight management systems, forcing the crew to delay departure while maintenance searched for a solution. Then, to everyone's surprise, Captain Michael Reynolds opened the cockpit door, walked into the cabin, and calmly addressed the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "the gentleman you saw entering our cockpit is not a passenger. He is Captain William Bill Carter, the retired test pilot who helped certify this very aircraft decades ago." The cabin fell completely silent. Captain Reynolds smiled respectfully before adding, "I've just asked Captain Carter to take the left seat with me." Hidden inside Bill's worn leather flight bag rested thousands of handwritten flight test notes collected over 45 years in the sky, along with one sealed letter from the instructor who had first taught him that airplanes are never truly unpredictable. They are simply waiting for someone patient enough to understand what they are trying to say. Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport was already bustling before sunrise as Flight 482 prepared for its scheduled departure to Denver. Ground crews loaded baggage beneath the wings of the Boeing 737 while passengers settled into their seats, expecting an ordinary 90-minute flight across the Rocky Mountains. Inside the cabin, flight attendants completed their final safety checks as Captain Michael Reynolds and First Officer Daniel Brooks finished programming the aircraft's flight management system. Just before the main cabin door closed, an 80-year-old man slowly boarded carrying a weathered brown leather flight bag. He wore a faded leather flight jacket with no visible airline logo, neatly pressed khaki trousers, polished black shoes, and a pair of old aviator sunglasses tucked into his jacket pocket. His silver hair and calm expression made him look more like a retired traveler than someone connected with the flight. Lead flight attendant Emma Collins immediately smiled when she saw him. "Good morning, Captain Carter," she said warmly. "They're expecting you." Several nearby passengers looked at one another with confusion. One businessman whispered, "Captain?" Another shrugged, "Probably just a nickname." Instead of turning toward his assigned seat, the elderly man quietly followed Emma toward the cockpit. As soon as the cockpit door opened, he stepped inside. Murmurs immediately spread through the cabin. "Why is a passenger going into the cockpit?" someone asked loudly. A woman sitting near the front pulled out her phone. "Is that even allowed?" Another passenger frowned. "They shouldn't let random people in there before departure." Within seconds, one frustrated traveler pressed the flight attendant call button. "I'd like an explanation," he said firmly. "That man isn't part of the crew." Emma remained calm. "Sir?" she replied politely. "Everything is under control." The passenger shook his head. "Then why is he sitting up front?" Before Emma could answer, the cockpit door quietly closed. Inside, Captain Michael Reynolds stood up the moment the elderly man entered. Smiling broadly, he extended both hands. "Captain Bill Carter," he said with genuine respect. "It's an honor to finally meet you." Bill smiled warmly. "Good to meet you too, Captain." First Officer Daniel Brooks looked equally excited. "I studied your flight test reports during simulator training." Bill laughed softly. "That was a long time ago." Michael shook his head. "Not in aviation." He pointed toward the aircraft around them. "Half the procedures we use in abnormal situations came from your certification flights." Bill looked around the cockpit, quietly admiring the familiar layout. His eyes rested for a moment on the control column before he gently placed his weathered leather flight bag behind the observer's seat. "She still feels familiar," he said with a smile. Michael nodded. "You helped teach this airplane how to fly." Bill chuckled. "No." He rested one hand on the instrument panel. "She taught me." Before anyone could continue the conversation, a warning tone suddenly sounded through the cockpit. Both pilots immediately turned toward the flight displays. One of the primary flight management computers had unexpectedly failed during the final departure sequence. Several navigation pages froze while caution messages appeared across the display. Daniel quickly began working through the electronic checklist. FMS-1 isn't responding. Michael contacted ground maintenance. We're holding at the gate. Outside the cockpit, passengers noticed the growing delay. Conversations became increasingly impatient. What's taking so long? We've been sitting here for 20 minutes. Maybe they should just switch airplanes. Inside the cockpit, maintenance technicians connected diagnostic equipment through the aircraft's service panel, but struggled to identify the source of the failure. One technician quietly admitted, "We've never seen this combination of messages before." Bill had remained silent the entire time, simply watching the displays without interfering. Finally, Michael looked toward him. "Captain," he asked respectfully, "would you mind taking a look?" Bill slowly stood, walked toward the captain's seat, and studied the frozen screens for only a few seconds. Then his eyes moved away from the electronics entirely. Instead, he looked at a small standby instrument tucked quietly beneath the main displays. A faint smile appeared on his face. "Interesting," he whispered. Michael noticed immediately. "You see something?" Bill nodded gently. "I don't think the airplane is trying to tell you the computer is broken." He looked back at the captain. "I think it's trying to tell you something else." Captain Michael Reynolds and First Officer Daniel Brooks exchanged a quick glance before stepping aside to give Bill Carter a better view of the instrument panel. The maintenance technicians remained inside the cockpit, laptops connected to the aircraft's diagnostic ports, yet none of their software had been able to explain why the flight management system had suddenly frozen during departure preparation. Bill never touched the keyboard. He never reached for the flight computer. Instead, he quietly observed the cockpit exactly as he had done thousands of times during his career. His eyes moved from the frozen navigation display to the standby attitude indicator, then toward the engine instruments, the electrical panel, and finally the overhead switches. After several seconds, he smiled. "The airplane isn't confused," he said calmly. "It's being misunderstood." One technician frowned. "The diagnostics show a flight management computer fault." Bill nodded politely. "Yes." He pointed toward the caution messages, but notice what appeared first. Daniel replayed the recorded sequence. The first alert had lasted less than a second before disappearing beneath a series of larger warnings. Bill gently tapped the display. "There." Michael leaned closer. "Electrical transfer?" Bill smiled. "Exactly." He looked toward the overhead panel. "The flight computer isn't the problem. It only reacted to it." The maintenance supervisor folded his arms. "So what actually happened?" Bill pointed toward one small power indication that almost everyone had ignored. The aircraft briefly lost a stable reference during an automatic electrical transfer. The computer protected itself exactly the way it was designed to do. Daniel looked surprised. "That would explain why every reset failed." Bill nodded. "Because you've been resetting the symptom." Silence filled the cockpit. Michael looked at the technicians. "Can we verify that?" The maintenance supervisor quickly began checking the electrical logs instead of the flight computer. Less than 2 minutes later, he slowly looked up from his screen. "He's right." He sounded almost stunned. There was a momentary transfer interruption before the flight management system locked. Another technician quietly shook his head. "We never even noticed it." Bill smiled gently. "Most people don't." Michael looked at him with admiration. "How did you?" Bill rested one hand on the back of the captain's seat. "Because 35 years ago," he smiled, "I watched the prototype do exactly the same thing." Everyone inside the cockpit froze. Daniel looked at him in disbelief. "You were there?" Bill nodded. "We spent 3 weeks trying to prove the computer was faulty." He chuckled softly. "Eventually, we discovered the airplane had been trying to tell us the truth from the very beginning." Michael laughed quietly. "And today, it did it again." Within minutes, the maintenance team corrected the electrical transfer issue, restarted the affected systems, and watched every flight display return to normal operation. The caution messages disappeared one after another. The maintenance supervisor looked at Bill before extending his hand. "Captain Carter," he said sincerely, "you solved in 5 minutes what we've been chasing for almost an hour." Bill shook his hand warmly. "No." He looked affectionately around the cockpit. "The airplane solved it." Just then, the dispatcher called the flight deck. "Maintenance reports the aircraft is fully serviceable." Michael acknowledged the message before ending the call. Then he turned toward Bill with a thoughtful smile. "Captain," he said quietly, "would you do me an honor?" Bill looked at him. Michael gently placed his hand on the captain's seat. "I'd like you to occupy the left seat for departure." Bill immediately shook his head. "This is your airplane. Michael smiled respectfully. Today, he glanced around the cockpit. We're simply borrowing it from the man who helped teach all of us how to fly it. At that exact moment, lead flight attendant Emma Collins called from the cabin. "Captain," she said over the interphone, "the passengers are becoming anxious. Some are still asking why the elderly gentleman is in the cockpit." Michael smiled. "I think," he replied calmly, "it's time they knew who Captain William Carter really is." Captain Michael Reynolds unfastened his headset and opened the cockpit door. The conversations inside the cabin immediately grew quieter as passengers looked toward the flight deck, expecting another announcement about the delay. Instead, Michael stepped into the aisle with a calm smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "thank you for your patience. The technical issue affecting our aircraft has been identified and corrected. We expect to depart shortly." A few passengers nodded with relief, but several still looked toward the elderly man standing quietly inside the cockpit. One passenger raised his hand. "Captain, why is that gentleman in the flight deck?" Michael smiled. "That's an excellent question." He looked back toward Bill Carter before continuing. "The man many of you believed was simply another passenger is Captain William Carter." He paused for a moment. More than 40 years ago, Captain Carter served as one of the senior experimental and certification test pilots who helped evaluate the systems and emergency procedures used on this aircraft family. A wave of surprised whispers spread through the cabin. Michael continued. "The problem that delayed our flight today involved a failure sequence so uncommon that none of us had ever personally encountered it. Captain Carter recognized it within minutes because he had seen the same behavior during certification testing decades ago." Complete silence filled the airplane. The businessman who had earlier complained slowly lowered his eyes. The woman who had questioned why an elderly passenger was allowed into the cockpit quietly put away her phone. Michael smiled warmly. "Every pilot sitting in this cockpit today has learned from people like Captain Carter, even if we've never had the privilege of meeting them before." He then turned toward the flight deck. "Captain Carter." Bill stepped into the doorway with his weathered leather flight jacket and old flight bag resting beside him. Michael looked at him with unmistakable respect. "Would you please join me in the left seat for engine start?" Bill hesitated. "Michael, this is your flight." Michael gently shook his head. "It is." He smiled. "But today I'd like my passengers to see the man whose work made flights like this safer for all of us." A quiet round of applause began near the front of the cabin, before spreading row by row until the entire aircraft was applauding. Bill looked almost embarrassed. He nodded politely toward the passengers before returning to the cockpit. Once seated in the captain's seat, he rested his hand lightly on the control column for the first time in many years. He never reached for the throttles or attempted to take command. Instead, he quietly observed while Michael completed every checklist exactly according to procedure. When the final engine stabilized, Bill smiled softly. "She still sounds healthy." Michael laughed. "You recognize that by sound?" Bill nodded. "An airplane tells you a great deal before the instruments ever do." As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, First Officer Daniel Brooks looked toward the old leather flight bag behind Bill's seat. "Captain," he asked quietly, "is that the same bag you carried during the certification program?" Bill smiled. "Every test flight." Daniel looked amazed. "What's inside?" Bill reached down and carefully opened the worn zipper. Resting inside were dozens of neatly organized handwritten notebooks, each labeled with dates stretching back more than 4 decades. Beneath them lay a faded envelope sealed with blue wax. Across the front, written in elegant handwriting, were only a few words, "For William. Open this when someone finally understands that airplanes are flown by judgment before they are flown by hands." Michael and Daniel exchanged a silent glance as the Boeing climbed smoothly into the morning sky, both realizing they were sitting beside a man whose greatest lesson had never been how to control an aircraft, but how to listen when it quietly tried to protect the people inside it. Once the aircraft reached its cruising altitude above the clouds, the cockpit settled into its familiar rhythm. The engines hummed steadily, the warning messages were gone, and Flight 482 was once again operating normally. Captain Michael Reynolds glanced toward Bill Carter before smiling. "Captain," he said quietly, "would you honor us by opening that letter?" Bill looked at the faded envelope resting inside his weathered flight bag. For several moments, he simply stared at the familiar handwriting before carefully breaking the old blue wax seal. First Officer Daniel Brooks removed his headset from one ear, while Michael lowered the cockpit speaker volume. Neither wanted to miss a single word. Bill unfolded the yellowed pages and began reading aloud. "Dear William, if you are opening this letter, then someone has finally realized that the safest pilot in the cockpit is not always the youngest or the fastest. It is the one who never stops learning from the airplane. Bill paused before continuing. People will praise your landings, admire your confidence, and remember the records you set during flight testing. Forget those things. Airplanes do not care about pride. They only respond to discipline, preparation, and respect. Michael quietly nodded. Bill turned the page. One day, cockpits will become filled with computers far more advanced than anything we can imagine today. Welcome every improvement. Let technology reduce workload and protect lives, but never allow automation to replace understanding. A pilot who only knows what the screen says will eventually meet a situation the screen cannot explain. Daniel slowly lowered his eyes toward the flight displays in front of him. Bill smiled gently before reading the next paragraph. Every warning light is a sentence. Every vibration is a question. Every unusual sound is a conversation. The airplane is always speaking. Your responsibility is not merely to operate it, but to understand what it is trying to tell you. Silence filled the cockpit, except for the steady sound of the engines. Bill unfolded the final page. If young pilots ever ask you what the greatest skill in aviation is, do not tell them it is precision, courage, or intelligence. Tell them it is humility. Because the pilot who believes there is nothing left to learn has already begun making dangerous decisions. Bill quietly folded the letter and returned it to the envelope. No one spoke for several long moments. Finally, Michael looked toward him with deep respect. Captain, I think every pilot should hear those words. Bill smiled. Every pilot eventually does. Michael looked puzzled. Bill gently rested his hand on the instrument panel. The airplane teaches the same lesson. A short time later, Flight 482 landed smoothly in Denver under clear blue skies. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, Michael made one final announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, he said over the public address system, today's flight arrived safely because of teamwork, professionalism, and the experience of someone who dedicated his life to making aviation safer for all of us. On behalf of this crew, thank you, Captain William Carter. Applause filled the cabin once again. After the passengers had disembarked, representatives from the airline and the Federal Aviation Administration were waiting at the gate. Standing beside them was a covered display that had quietly been prepared in advance. When the cloth was removed, it revealed a polished exhibit containing Bill's faded leather flight jacket, his original flight helmet, the weathered leather flight bag, the handwritten certification notebooks, and the letter from his instructor. At the center stood a bronze plaque engraved with the words, "The William Carter Aviation Legacy," dedicated to the test pilot who taught generations that airplanes are safest in the hands of those humble enough to keep listening. Michael stood beside the display before turning toward the young pilots gathered nearby. "Remember today," he said softly. "We didn't ask Captain Carter to help because he was once famous." He smiled toward the elderly pilot. "We asked because wisdom never retires." The story of Captain William Bill Carter quickly spread throughout the aviation community. At first, news reports described the unusual delay of a commercial flight after an elderly passenger entered the cockpit, but as the details emerged, pilots across the country discovered that the quiet man carrying the worn leather flight bag had once helped shape the very aircraft. Many of them flew every day. Aviation magazines, flight schools, and airline training departments began discussing the incident, not as a story about an aging pilot saving a flight, but as a reminder that experience earned through decades of disciplined observation can never be replaced by technology alone. 1 year later, the Federal Aviation Administration invited Bill to speak during the annual orientation for newly hired airline pilots. Hundreds of captains, first officers, check airmen, simulator instructors, and aviation engineers gathered inside the National Training Center, expecting to hear stories about flight testing or famous certification flights. Instead, Bill walked onto the stage, carrying only his weathered leather flight bag. He slowly opened it and removed the oldest of his handwritten flight notebooks. Looking across the silent audience, he smiled gently before reading the first sentence written on the opening page, more than 45 years earlier. "Before you ask what the airplane is doing, first ask what it is trying to tell you." He quietly closed the notebook again. "People often ask me what the most difficult airplane I ever flew was," he began. "The truth is," he smiled softly, "no airplane ever wanted to surprise me." The audience listened without moving. Every abnormal situation I encountered gave me clues long before it became an emergency. He rested one hand on the notebook. The real challenge was learning to notice them before they became obvious. Complete silence filled the auditorium. Bill continued, "The greatest danger in aviation is not complicated technology." He looked around the room. "It is becoming so comfortable with that technology that you stop paying attention to the airplane itself." Captain Michael Reynolds, seated in the front row, quietly smiled. Those words reminded him of the morning when a retired test pilot had solved a problem that no diagnostic computer had immediately recognized. At the conclusion of the ceremony, the FAA unveiled the William Carter Aviation Learning Center, established to preserve the history of flight testing and the lessons that had shaped generations of pilots. Inside the exhibit rested Bill's faded leather flight jacket, his original flight helmet, the weathered leather flight bag, thousands of handwritten certification notes, the instructor's letter, and the brass nameplate from the flight test program. Visitors expected the first display to feature technical drawings or engineering achievements. Instead, they found a single handwritten question displayed beneath soft lighting. "What is the airplane trying to tell you?" Every newly hired airline pilot entering the learning center was asked to stand before that question before beginning a single simulator session. Years later, after Captain William Carter peacefully passed away at the age of 94, airline crews from across the United States gathered to honor him. There were no speeches celebrating records, flight hours, or test programs. Instead, one by one, captains quietly placed handwritten notebooks beside his portrait, promising that they would continue teaching future pilots to observe before assuming, to understand before reacting, and to listen before deciding. Above the entrance to the William Carter Aviation Learning Center, a bronze inscription welcomed every future pilot with the words that would forever define his legacy. "Technology can assist your hands. Wisdom guides your judgment. The safest pilot is the one who never believes the learning has ended." Those who visited the center often admired the old flight bag, the faded jacket, and the notebooks that had traveled through thousands of hours in the sky. But those who truly understood William Carter's life realized that his greatest contribution had never been helping certify an airplane. It was teaching generations of aviators that every safe landing begins long before the wheels touch the runway. It begins with the humility to keep learning from an airplane that is always quietly telling its crew exactly what they need to know if they are willing to listen. The story of Captain William Bill Carter soon spread throughout the aviation world. At first, newspapers described it as the remarkable incident in which an elderly passenger entered the cockpit before departure and helped solve a technical problem that had delayed an airline flight. But as pilots, engineers, and aviation historians learned who Bill Carter truly was, the story became something far greater than a delayed departure. It became a reminder that the safest airplanes are not protected by technology alone, but by the wisdom of the people who understand how to use it. In the years that followed, airlines, flight academies, aircraft manufacturers, and aviation training centers across the United States shared Bill's story with every new generation of pilots. Not because he had flown thousands of hours, not because he had helped certify one of the world's most successful airliners, but because he demonstrated that experience is not measured by age, it is measured by the number of times someone has remained humble enough to keep learning. Whenever young pilots asked Bill what the most important instrument in an airplane was, he always smiled before giving the same answer. "None of them," he would say. "The most important instrument is still the mind of the pilot who knows how to understand what every other instrument is trying to say." During his final public appearance at the National Aviation Leadership Conference, Bill walked onto the stage carrying the same worn leather flight bag that had traveled beside him through more than 4 decades of flight testing. Instead of displaying engineering drawings or technical manuals, he quietly removed a single blank flight log page and held it up before the audience. Hundreds of airline captains, test pilots, aerospace engineers, instructors, and student aviators watched in complete silence. Bill smiled gently. "Every flight begins with an empty page," he said. "That means the airplane hasn't made a mistake yet." He paused. "Neither has the pilot." Soft laughter spread across the room. Bill continued, "The safest crews I've ever flown with were never the ones who believed they had all the answers." He looked around the auditorium. They were the ones who kept asking better questions. He carefully placed the blank page back inside the flight bag. "An airplane almost always tells you what it needs." He smiled. "Your job is to notice before it has to say it twice." The audience rose together in a standing ovation. Years after Captain William Carter peacefully passed away, His faded leather flight bag, weathered flight jacket, handwritten certification notebooks, and instructor's letter remained preserved inside the William Carter Aviation Learning Center. Above them hung a simple bronze plaque carrying the words that every new pilot read before entering a flight simulator for the first time. The airplane is always speaking. The wisest pilot is the one who never stops listening. Visitors often admired the artifacts of a remarkable aviation career, but those who truly understood Bill Carter's legacy realized that his greatest achievement had never been helping certify an airplane or solving a single technical problem on one ordinary morning. His greatest achievement was teaching generations of aviators that professionalism begins with curiosity, safety begins with humility, and every successful flight depends not only on powerful engines or sophisticated computers, but on a pilot who is willing to keep learning from the aircraft every single time it leaves the ground.